Hello and welcome. You're watching the continuous coverage here on Wion World is One of the Modi-Xi informal summit happening at Mamallapuram in the southern Indian state of Tamil Nadu. And we are just moments away from day 2 of the informal summit. But just to bring our viewers up to speed with what happened yesterday in Mamallapuram, Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping will hold their second round of informal talks in Chennai today. Yesterday, the informal summit in Mamallapuram showed a close bonhomie between the two world leaders. Trade continued to remain the top focus between the two countries. Modi and Xi held intensive talks on the need to encourage more trade between the two nations.
The entire group of monuments.
They also spoke about other developmental priorities. In particular, there was some discussion on trade-related issues, on economic issues, on trying to identify areas for investment that the two countries could encourage, and also on how to enhance the trade volume and the trade value. And in this also obviously included the issue of the trade deficit that exists and the unbalanced trade that exists.
India and China, terror and radicalization were top priorities during the informal summit. Both Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Xi Jinping pledged to work closely to deal with the global threat of terrorism. Listen in.
Some of the other topics included the challenges that both countries face on account of terrorism. There was an acknowledgement that both countries are very complex, they are very diverse. Both leaders said that these were large countries and that radicalization was a matter of concern to both. And that both would work together to see that radicalization and terrorism did not affect the fabric of our multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious societies. And there was a general sense that both leaders had that this was a common challenge that we face and that we will work together to overcome it.
As the main superpowers in the region, the Mamallapuram summit highlighted the close relations between the two countries. Both Modi and Xi spent almost 5 hours of quality time. The personal rapport between the two was clearly on display as they toured the heritage sites.
There have been nearly 5 hours of discussion and quality time that the Prime Minister and President Xi Jinping of China have spent together. Most of this was one-to-one, with the exception of the half-hour cultural program.
And as we wait for the day 2 of the informal summit to begin in Mamallapuram, I am joined by two very special guests in the Wion World is One studio in New Delhi. Ambassador Arun Singh, who has served as India's ambassador to the US, France and Israel, and Ambassador Vishnu Prakash, who has served in South Korea and also in China. Ambassador Singh, if I can come to you first, what did you make of day 1 of the informal summit? What were the bigger takeaways for you from the informal talks at Mamallapuram?
I think day 1 was used in the manner in which it was intended, focusing largely on the optics and the personal chemistry between the leaders. Because I think the message has been for more than a year and a half now, in the run-up to Wuhan and beyond, that part of the challenges in the India-China relationship would be addressed by building a better relationship at the senior leadership level and a better understanding of strategic direction, strategic concerns, and based on what emerges from their decisions and discussions, guidance would be sent down the line so that any differences that arise can be handled with restraint. And I think that has been the broad message. Now, since then, a lot of issues have arisen in the India-China relationship. China's support to Pakistan at the UN Security Council in the context of our decision on Article 370. China inviting Imran Khan to visit Beijing at this moment before he comes to India, so that Pakistan is not in any way concerned at whatever emerges from the meetings in Delhi. Again, a signal that whatever is done with India, the interests of Pakistan from China's perspective will be kept in view. So given all the challenges and differences in the relationship, I think the aim is that to signal that despite all that, the effort for positive direction is continuing, and there is a certain understanding at the top level. So, you know, both the leaders, both the countries are really playing the long game, and you have to take it from there.
All right. Both sides wanting to play the long game, says Ambassador Arun Singh. I want to take a moment to introduce my third guest who is joining us on this discussion, Manjeet Kripalani, Executive Director and co-founder of the think tank called Gateway House. Thank you so much for joining us on Wion World is One. Ambassador Vishnu Prakash, if I can come to you now. Now, from Wuhan to Mamallapuram, what do you make of the positions from where the two leaders come from? Prime Minister Modi is coming in from a re-election on a bigger mandate. President Xi is beset by domestic crises at home, be it Hong Kong or Taiwan or the issue of the ill treatment of the minorities in Xinjiang. So how would you contrast the two leaders who are going to hold their second round of talks this morning as we speak?
Well, there is a continuation in more ways than one. Certainly, Prime Minister Modi has come with a stronger mandate, and the mandate of the people of India, which is remarkable, a 6% increase in the vote share. President Xi is almost a president for life, and he appears to be in control. There are issues, there are pushbacks. Slowing economy is another issue, concern of theirs, in addition to what you mentioned. But I think it's not just that they are bogged down by 1, 2 or 3, they are working on those issues. But when it comes to India, what I see is that between Wuhan and Mahabalipuram, there has in fact been some hardening of positions when it comes to China. And there we are talking terrorism, we are talking Kashmir, we are talking Pakistan. And so we have to, in a way, pick up the threads again. And the important thing is that for the first time, President Xi will be here getting a perspective from none other than the Prime Minister on Kashmir, again on terrorism and on trade. So I guess these are some of the important issues which are emerging, or matters on which the two leaders are focusing.
All right. Just to remind our viewers, these are the live visuals coming to you from the Taj Fisherman's Cove Resort and Spa, where Prime Minister Modi is in attendance to receive his Chinese guest, President Xi Jinping, for day 2 of the informal summit at Mamallapuram. These are the live visuals coming to you.
We see the arrival
and
of the
any moment now we can see the first visuals of Xi Jinping greeting Prime Minister Modi for the day 2 of their engagements in Mamallapuram.
Mr. Xi Jinping emerges. A warm handshake between the two leaders.
बहुत गर्मजोशी से स्वागत और अगवानी प्रधानमंत्री श्री नरेंद्र मोदी ने चीनी राष्ट्रपति शी जिनपिंग की अगवानी के बाद अब दोनों नेता इस यादगार तस्वीर के लिए इस शिखर वार्ता की.
All right, just to bring our viewers up to speed with the latest news here on Beyond World is One. These are the live visuals of Prime Minister Modi and President Xi meeting on day 2 of their informal summit in Tamil Nadu. They met yesterday at Mamallapuram, and they will continue the discussions over lunch today as well. And the entire range of regional and global issues can be expected to figure in their discussions today. And just to put this into context for our viewers, they are meeting for the second time. The first time they met was at Wuhan in April last year. And this summit takes place at a time when a geopolitical flux happening in the environments of both India and China. And yesterday, according to India's Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale, both leaders discussed trade and terrorism, besides other bilateral issues. And today, the two principals can be expected to discuss regional and global issues as well. Remember, they spent close to 5 hours yesterday at Mamallapuram over dinner.
Indo-China relations.
And Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale described it as quality time spent by the two principals without note takers, without interpreters at hand. So this was one-on-one between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi all through yesterday afternoon and evening. And while we stay on these visuals, I want to run through the engagements today expected in Tamil Nadu. So they will meet for a tete-a-tete, followed by delegation-level talks. And at 11:45 India time, Prime Minister Modi will host President Xi for lunch. And President Xi can be expected to depart at about 12:45 for Chennai, from where he will fly out.
For a warm conversation.
So that's the engagement for this morning. And as we speak, the two leaders are meeting for the second round of the informal talks. And at this point in time, I want to go across to my other guest who is joining us from Mumbai, Manjeet Kripalani. As we watch these visuals, Manjeet Kripalani, what would you say would be one of the bigger outcomes from the discussions today in Tamil Nadu?
I think that we should, it's kind of hard to look for anything including, a big outcome from trade. And that's partly because, India has not moved as fast economically as it should.
Right.
But there are many, many issues at hand between India and China. Our interests don't converge that much. We have much more contestation with each other than we have convergence. And I think that we hopefully should be working on those. For instance, Indian knowledge of China is extremely limited. We don't have enough people teaching, we don't have enough Indians who know Mandarin, we don't have any China studies departments except at JNU and maybe some other universities. Think tanks aren't being encouraged to study China as much. We don't have any China studies in our universities. This is what will build an understanding between two countries, more than just two very dynamic leaders talking to each other. In terms of trade, our business people are really just dependent on China for imports. I don't know how much effort is being made between the chambers of commerce to really think about what we can do. So China doesn't get enough of our IT exports, for instance, and China really doesn't want it. It's a threat to China. But there is a way of doing it. Our IT industry has to be more proactive. Rather than just selling, they have to look at it in a strategic way. How can we expand the trade ties? How can they be brought in to say that, our IT business will reduce the burden, and how do we bring China into this very strategic advantage that India has? So I hope these issues will be discussed, and although the government has said that we cannot have a Chinese presence or investment in Indian universities, we need to expand our knowledge of China, the country,
right,
China, the polity, and China, the society.
Manjeet Kripalani, you make some very valid arguments there, but just to take off on one point where you left. Now, you spoke about the issues at the ground, at the shop floor, so to speak. Yes. But would you agree that the top-down diplomacy, as exemplified by the two leaders in question here this morning in Tamil Nadu, would the top-down diplomacy work in India-China relations going forward?
Well, this is the first time we've had really a meeting of equals. Our countries are not equal because China economically is doing much better than India, but certainly the two leaders are equal. So the top-down diplomacy is absolutely required, and this has opened the doors for all of India to understand and know China a little bit better through their leader.
All right.
However, in terms of politics, China is very much a top-down political environment. India is bottom-up. So we need to create those understandings. We're very different, and the meeting at Mahabalipuram, I think, has showcased India's diversity to Chinese President Xi Jinping very well, and hopefully understands our own regard for our history and how embedded it is in our future and in our current present.
Fair point, Manjeet Kripalani. Do hold your thoughts. Ambassador Vishnu Prakash, you wanted to come in?
I just wanted to make one point that there are some misconceptions in China about India and in India about China. There is also a trust deficit. Now, what happens is that when the two leaders meet and meet the way the Prime Minister of India and President Xi Jinping are meeting, the bonhomie is visible, this messaging is quite clear. It sends a good message down the line. And that is something in the Chinese system it's taken note of, that this is the leader's orientation. I mean, certainly what he goes back and conveys to his people are different. But across the line, at the popular level, there is a positive messaging. So it does create an enabling environment for, or people become more receptive to each other's point of view. That, I think, is one of the positives of a top-down approach.
Right, and Ambassador Singh, if I can bring you in the discussion as we watch these live visuals coming to us of day 2 of the informal summit between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi, which has begun just moments ago. Ambassador Singh, Manjeet Kripalani pointing out that India-China ties are at the moment being described as more competition and less of cooperation. Would you agree with that submission, or you think there is still scope for a more nuanced take on where things stand between New Delhi and Beijing as we speak?
I think Manjeet is right to the point that there are a lot of differences between the two countries, and at the same time an attempt is being made for convergence. Right. And that in a way started in 1988 when Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi had gone to China, and there was a message at that time that differences are there, but the two countries would try and build areas of cooperation. Sure. Of course, it has gone through ups and downs, which shows the continuation of the differences, because the objective interests of the two countries don't really converge. And then in terms of subsequent developments, the China-Pakistan economic corridor, for example, that is being built by China, looking at its own interests, looking at building its relationship with Pakistan, looking at getting access to Gwadar and the Arabian Sea directly through Pakistan, is a challenge to India's security and also India's sovereignty. So therefore, China has been taking decisions as it perceives in its own interests, which does not factor in India's interests. And that includes the recent support it has provided to Pakistan on Article 370. So I think those differences will be there. Also, as China's economy and military strength has increased, its footprint in our region, in South Asia, in the Indian Ocean, has increased. It has now has a lease on Hambantota port. It has base facilities in Djibouti. More and more Chinese ships are present in the Indian Ocean region. And not only did President Xi invite Imran Khan to Beijing before coming here, but on his way back he's going through Nepal. As well, right? And there's a clear message there that China is injecting itself.
A deliberate message, would you say?
Deliberate message, that it is injecting itself in South Asia. Because for a long time India's policy had been to keep China out of South Asia. See South Asia is essentially an area where India would build areas of cooperation, and outside powers won't have the same kind of influence, particularly China. And there was a time when many other South Asian countries wanted to make China part of SAARC. And India had resisted that. And eventually it only became an observer in SAARC. So with the changed economic and military strengths, China is signaling that it is injecting itself in South Asia, and the kind of relationships it has built with Sri Lanka, with Bangladesh, it attempted with the previous government in Maldives. So that's a challenge that India is going to face. And it will inject areas of dissonance repeatedly. But while that is happening, you also need to build on areas of convergence.
Sure.
And I think therefore, as Vishnu mentioned, the meeting at the top level to signal that areas of convergence are also being built upon is a very important way of dealing with the challenges.
Ambassador Prakash, I know you want to come in at this point in time, but I want to go quickly across to Manjeet Kripalani. You wanted to weigh in, Manjeet?
Yes, I did. One of the things there's going to be a discussion on trade today, and I know trade and services will be discussed. You know, China has been investing in India, and it has been largely in data services and social media. TikTok, as you know, is more popular than YouTube in India. Now, this is a huge problem for India because China harvests all that data. So they know a lot about us. We are unable to control this because we are a free society, just like the United States is. So if we have to learn from China, one of the things we should learn, and the government should take tips on this, China has learned to build an ecosystem around new areas of interest. So the reason they're so big on AI and social media is because the government has provided a very, very fertile ground for building the ecosystem. And in some sense, China has learned from the United States on how to fail and even then have a lot of big companies, you know, like the BAT, the Baidu, Alibaba and Tencent companies, to dominate, and they dominate the world today. So we can, although we are vulnerable to China in so many ways, our security is not just military security, it's also data security and knowledge. We should be able to learn from China on how to become as strong. Our IT companies are very weak, they're just followers. They don't really take an initiative. They just want to make their $25 an hour, or maybe it's $18 now. But they really have not taken the initiative. So we need to push them to be leaders so that we can develop a big ecosystem and be a good competitor, a good, fair competitor to China in the democratic world, and in Asia in particularly.
All right, point taken, Manjeet. As we watch these visuals of the two principals, Prime Minister Modi and President Xi, holding a tete-a-tete on day 2 of the informal summit in Tamil Nadu. Ambassador Vishnu Prakash, you wanted to come in on this discussion.
Yeah, what I want to underscore is that there is a disconnect between two aspects, self-perception and worldview. Now, China calls itself Chugaku, or a middle kingdom. And there is this attitude of being an all-powerful emperor, and others in the region should be kind of quoting them. And they are out to build, or at least that's what they want to do, they want to build a China-centric regional and international order where our role is different from what we perceive our role as. And that is where the disconnect comes in, because China historically has tried to box India into the South Asian framework. And now that India is rising economically, politically, strategically, there is a disconnect in how we look at each other, how we perceive the role at each other, and that needs to be harmonized. And therein lies the difficulty, because that would require a lot of give and take, trust building, and we'll have to stay the course. We'll have to have many more informal summits and formal summits to try and find a meeting ground on that front.
Sure. Ambassador Singh?
So I just wanted to add to what Manjeet was saying on trade issues, that aside from the trade deficit, what hasn't got the same attention is the extensive presence of Chinese companies in many critical sectors in India. If you look at mobile phones, for example, large part of the market is now dominated by Chinese companies. If you look at the financial technology sector, an area where government of India has been giving a lot of emphasis because of wanting to digitize payments, again, Chinese companies or Chinese funded companies have a very strong presence, and again also in e-commerce. So that's something one has to watch, because the question is, who gets the leverage? Does India get leverage because of their presence here, or does China get leverage because of their presence here? That's something that needs to be watched closely, because of late we have found that whenever Chinese companies find that Chinese state sensitives are involved, they kowtow to the Chinese state. And the Chinese state has no hesitation in generating pressure on foreign companies and entities if they feel that they're in some way challenging what China defines its interests or core interests. And recently a major powerful US entity such as the National Basketball Association, which is flush with funds, really was seen as going down on its knees because one of their members seemed to be supporting the protesters in Hong Kong. And China cracked the whip on their access to television, access to advertisements. And this is something they've generated not just on the NBA, but many other companies. Recently there were reports that Apple took an app off its platform because the Chinese government didn't like it. So that's something that one has to watch, that as this deeper engagement with China happens on the economic, technological sectors, what are the challenges and pressures that other societies face?
Right. And Manjeet, as we watch these live visuals of the two principals holding a tete-a-tete on day 2 of the informal summit in Tamil Nadu, since you touched upon the issue of trade, now yesterday, according to India's Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale, the two leaders discussed about trade and terrorism in particular. Now, talking about their discussions on trade, would you say that this informal summit may pave the way for India to join the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, comprising the 10 ASEAN countries and 6 other countries in the region? Would that pave the way for India's eventual accession to RCEP, you think?
Well, it will if China agrees to our terms, which is to take 20 years in which to reduce.
But what would you recommend, if I can put you in a spot there, Manjeet? You think India should sign up to RCEP?
Well, if China agrees to our terms, yes, we should.
Okay.
We need to get into the world trade system. You know, we're really out of it. It will help our companies become very strong. It will help our small businesses as well. We should be in the world trade groupings, and unless we jump in, we're not going to be able to strengthen ourselves. So I hope it happens, but really with China, we have to be very, very careful.
All right, Manjeet Kripalani says that India needs to be very careful on the way forward on trade in particular. But just to come back to the point which Ambassador Singh raised, Ambassador Vishnu Prakash, he says China wants to box India into South Asia and restrict our engagement to this part of the world. But if you look at the larger big picture emerging on the world map today, we have something called the Indo-Pacific, with more emphasis on the Indo-Pacific by the 4 countries, namely India, the US, Japan and Australia. And most recently, on the sidelines of the UNGA in New York, the Quad countries raised their discussions to the foreign ministerial level. Now, these are the 4 countries which call themselves the Quad. Now, according to some observers in India in particular, there is an anti-India Quad developing at the same time as well, and that comprises China, Pakistan, Turkey and Malaysia. Your thoughts on the juxtaposition of these 2 groupings for India in the times ahead?
Very much. It's a fact that China is an adversary, and our challenge is to make sure that that adversarial relationship doesn't become inimical, while at the same time trying to reduce the differences and build on the convergences. So that is the broad objective. But we have, you know, it takes two to tango when you want to build a relationship. You have to be sensitive to each other's core concerns. India has been sensitive to China's core concerns. There are many fault lines in China. We have not been talking about it. But the reverse is not true.
For instance?
Well, look at what is happening in Hong Kong. Look at what is happening in Xinjiang. Look at what is happening in South China Sea.
So are you therefore suggesting that India's position still very much is diffident when it comes to China?
It is not diffident.
Is India on the defensive?
It is not defensive, but certainly we have to calibrate it. Let's be frank about it. China is, there is a symmetry in the power of India and China. China is a big power, militarily, economically. We want to build relations with China. We do not want, as I said, to increase the difficulties, increase the antagonism between our sides. So what are we doing? We are signaling, for example, through the Shangri-La, at the Shangri-La conference, Prime Minister outlined the vision of Indo-Pacific. And ours is not an exclusive vision. At the same time, we are certainly interacting with countries around China, close to China, beyond China, to increase our leverage. But we are also careful about Chinese sensitivities in the hope that they will similarly be careful about our sensitivities.
Right.
And that is not happening. Expectation is that the more we talk to each other, because I don't think that it is in China's interest also to have a conflict with India. So that is the objective, and they say, China, you cannot change the geography. You have a mighty neighbor on our border, and you have to try and find a modus vivendi.
Right, Ambassador Singh, that's a very valid point that Ambassador Prakash makes. As the late Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee said, you can change your friends but not your neighbors. And that might be true in the case of India-China ties as well. Now, taking off the point where he left, in the recent days leading up to the informal summit in Tamil Nadu, we've seen China make a lot of statements, be it at the UNGA, be it in the UN Security Council, be it even in their bilateral engagement with Pakistan. We've seen the Chinese envoy in Pakistan talking about Jammu and Kashmir and talking about self-determination and so on. So this overt support to Pakistan is there for all to see. At the same time, there is a view in India building up that why is India not taking the battle, so to speak, into the Chinese camp by talking about what's happening in Hong Kong, what's happening in Xinjiang, what's happening to Taiwan, what's happening to the perennial issue of Tibet. So why is India being so different when it comes to China?
I think you have to work out your strategy based on what is most effective. And as I had mentioned earlier, both countries are playing the long game. And China's long game clearly is that it sees itself emerging as a strong and perhaps even a dominant power in this part of the world, with the differentials in economic strength, military strength, and therefore its support that it is providing to Pakistan, which it has provided for a long time, because it sees its relationship with Pakistan becoming more and more dependent on China. Economically dependent, militarily dependent, because today China is the main supplier of military equipment to Pakistan, gives China a handle on a way of generating pressure on India as and when it would like to do that. And then it is also building its presence in Indian Ocean, relations with other countries in India's neighborhood. And India's long game clearly has to be that while protecting your interests, don't allow the relationship with China to descend to a point of real tension and conflict, while you use the opportunity to also build up your economic and military strength, but be very firm where your own interests are involved. So recently, for example, when Chinese statements came out in support of Pakistan's position, there was a clear response from India. The Chinese know very well India's position related to Jammu and Kashmir, and it's an internal matter of India. So you need to assert that, and beyond that you have to see which strategy works for you and play that to your maximum advantage. Now, for example, in the briefing that Foreign Secretary did yesterday, he spoke about convergence on dealing with the challenge of radicalization.
Right.
And there can be a signal that if China is talking about radicalization in Xinjiang, India's steps in Jammu and Kashmir have also been meant to deal with the challenge of radicalization and terrorism in Jammu and Kashmir, supported by Pakistan, even though our position is clear that we are not going to be really talking about Jammu and Kashmir as such, because that's an internal matter. So there are ways of signaling where your concerns are and yet attempting to build the relationship. So, for example, India has come out again with a very strong statement against Turkey's move. And then you have to judge whether that's the right step to take. And in the case of China, how do you get your advantage without necessarily replicating the same step? I think that's the way.
Ambassador Prakash?
I think Arun makes a very valid point about the signaling, and that is very East Asian, because you need to be subtle to put across a point of view.
But would subtlety work with the Chinese?
I'm coming to that. It does. It does. They do take note of the fact, because it's quite evident that at 3.5 hours of dinner, I mean 3.5 hours one-on-one is a long time to have a dinner. So I mean, obviously they've had a very good chat about various issues. Now, the difficulty is also, we know that when it comes to general terms, China talks about terrorism and they condemn terrorism. That they, like Pakistan, differentiate between good terrorists and bad terrorists. So people who are affecting Pakistan's and China's interests are bad terrorists. Now look at what they did in the case of Masood Azhar. So obviously a gentle and a firm message, even if it's a delicate message, has to go that this far and no further. Because we cannot allow status quo to prevail.
Sure. Right, so thus far and no further, the status quo is untenable, says Ambassador Vishnu Prakash. And it is getting to 40 minutes past 10 a.m. India time, and the tete-a-tete is still on as we speak. These are the live visuals coming to you from Tamil Nadu of the two principals, President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Narendra Modi, holding their day 2 of the informal talks, the informal summit happening in Tamil Nadu as we speak. All right, if I can go to my guest, Manjeet Kripalani. Manjeet, if I were to ask you to take a step back and look at the big picture evolving as we speak, from the journey from Wuhan to Mamallapuram, and about the style of summitry by Prime Minister Modi. We saw him engage a number of world leaders over the last 5 odd years. starting with the Chai Pe Charcha with Barack Obama in New Delhi, followed by the Wuhan summit last year, and the informal summit with Vladimir Putin again last year, and now this informal summit in Tamil Nadu. So what's your sense of the message that Prime Minister Modi is sending out to the world at large?
Mr. Modi, our Prime Minister, is a consummate diplomat, and he is a statesman now on the global stage. In order to protect India, he's gone out there and told everybody, I'm in charge. If you want anything to do with India, let me know. If you want to attack India, I'm on the front lines. He is also our salesman in chief. So he has done an absolutely fantastic job of putting India on the world stage. He isn't making any claims about what India can do. He is simply telling people what India is.
Right.
And I think that is at the moment we don't have a lot that we can do, but certainly by just stating who we are, it sends a very clear message to people, is that we're not ready yet to step onto the global stage and tell people what to do, tell China what to do in Hong Kong, etc. But certainly we are here, and he is doing a very good job of keeping the dragon at bay, which is required. His style of summitry is unprecedented. He is a very quick learner. Learnability is everything. He has sent a fantastic message domestically this morning by picking up the plastic on the beaches. This has come immediately upon a statement made last week by the G20 countries, saying that they were going to address the issue of plastics in the oceans. So he is very in tune with what's going on internationally and domestically, and he's sending a strong message at home as well as internationally to say, yes, we hear you and we're doing our bit. So he is a consummate politician and he's a consummate diplomat.
All right, Manjeet Kripalani, thank you so much for sharing your insights into this developing story, the second informal summit between India and China. Appreciate it.